now.
Well, greetings and welcome everyone to our session today. I'm Paul Schacht, Director of the Center for Digital Learning here at Geneseo and a member of the English department. And we're here for a conversation with Shalini Kantayya, Director of the terrific documentary film Coded Bias, available to the Geneseo community this week to stream for free. Today's session is part of our celebration of Black History Month at SUNY Geneseo and our project of becoming an anti-racist college. February's month-long series of events and sessions was planned and organized by the Anti-Racism and DEI Subcommittee of the President's Commission on Diversity and Community. We hope it will spark discussion, reflection, and action as the college works to realize its vision of anti-racism. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all participants to please mute their mics during the conversation. However, please do use the chat to ask questions, which we can then share with our guest. In every one of this month's sessions, we've asked that all questions and comments be grounded in respect. We will not abide disrespect toward the presenter, moderator, or other participants. And although we don't anticipate having to remove any participant for violating this rule, we want to let you know that we reserve the right to do so. So now it's with the greatest pleasure that I introduce our guest, Shalini Kantayya, whose film Coded Bias premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim. Previously, she directed the season finale of the National Geographic television series Breakthrough, whose executive producer was Ron Howard, and which was broadcast globally in June 2017. Her debut film, Catching the Sun, premiered at the LA Film Festival and was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Catching the Sun's executive producer was Leonardo DiCaprio, and it was released globally on Netflix on Earth Day 2016. It was nominated for the Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary. Shalini Kantayya is a TED Fellow, a William J. Fulbright Scholar, and an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. And I just learned when she joined us today that this is actually her second visit to SUNY Geneseo. First virtual visit, I guess, but second visit to SUNY Geneseo. So welcome, Shalini, and welcome to all of you. We're going to begin by showing the trailer of Coded Bias for those who perhaps did not have the opportunity to watch the film, and then we'll follow that with open Q&A. So Dave, you want to cue it up?
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask. I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera, or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child.
Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
It's not just face classification, it's any data-centric technology.
Every day, we are all being scored.
Who gets hired, who gets housing.
I am making predictions for your life right now.
The people who own the code deploy it on other people, and there is no accountability.
Management at Atlantic Towers wanted to install the facial recognition software. Pretty much turn this place into Fort Knox.
The technology is being rapidly adopted, and there are no safeguards.
We are socially controlled in a way that we don't see.
technology that analyzes faces could be biased, but the company is pushing it anyway.
What demographic is it most effective on?
White men.
Show me that it's going to be fair, that it's legal before you put it out. That's what we don't have yet.
It's going to take people coming together, striving for justice in this age of automation.
So I'd like to say thank you to Shalini for this wonderful film. It's very thought-provoking and eye-opening, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion. Shalini, could you say a little bit about how the film Coded Bias came about?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I just want to thank SUNY Geneseo for having me and for committing to be an anti-racist institution. I want to commend your efforts for having conversations like this one. It's my deep belief that it's actually how the world changes. So thank you so much for having me and hosting the film. 3 years ago, I didn't know what an algorithm was. Everything I knew about artificial intelligence was from the mind of Steven Spielberg. And I really had no idea the ways in which algorithms, machine learning, AI is already becoming a gatekeeper of opportunity. Sometimes being the first gatekeeper, deciding who gets hired, who gets into college, how long a prison sentence someone serves, who gets what quality of healthcare these days, who gets what vaccine when. Algorithms are all in these decision-making capacities, and we are increasingly, as human beings, outsourcing our decision-making to machines. And what I learned in the making of Coded Bias is that these very systems that we're outsourcing such intimate decisions to have not been vetted for racial bias, for gender bias, that they won't do unintended harm to people who have already been sort of vulnerable to systematic inequality, and that sometimes they're not even accurate by some shared sort of understanding of what accuracy is outside of their company. And what I began to see was that big technology companies were putting things in the hands of law enforcement with no one we elected, no one that represents we the people, in a place of oversight. And that's when I began to see really clearly that we could roll back 50 years of civil rights advances in the names of machine neutrality, in the name of not understanding this kind of soft, unseen power that is taking place, that is sort of opaque to us. And that's when I began to realize that algorithmic justice is, exactly as Joy says, the civil rights issue of our time.
So if 3 years ago you weren't familiar with what an algorithm was, what brought you into the story? How did you stumble upon this facial recognition technology and the MIT researcher Joy, who's really at the center of your story?
Yes, well, I do want to start by saying that I'm a public education kid, and I did my master's at the City College of New York. So I have a great affection for the SUNY system as the Harvard of the proletariat. And it's my belief that what has happened in big tech is that you have a really elite group of people making decisions that impact us all. And in big tech, that has been a community that's really white, really male, really from upper middle class backgrounds, really have gone to elite institutions like Stanford and MIT and these sort of elitist institutions, even though great students are coming out of San Jose State, right in the backyard of Silicon Valley. And what I began to realize is that, I think we're having a national conversation about bias, like we're all talking about. And what I realized in the making of this film is a lot of compassion, because bias is not something just bad cops have. It's not something that a few bad eggs have. It's an innate human condition. And that's what I began to understand in the making of this film, is that we all have human bias. And so it becomes a thing that we have to control for. And for me, I think that, you know, for those of us who don't come from these elite backgrounds, I know that when I first went to elite institutions, I had this thing where I was like, oh my God, I'm going to use AI or machine learning out of context. I'll have improper usage and everyone is going to laugh at me. And I sort of come from a family where I was raised by a single immigrant mom. My first language wasn't English. My mom had a very limited vocabulary. And so when I first went into these elite institutions, I would like cry. I was like, oh my God, everyone is smarter than me. And I don't know all these words. And then I would write down all the words in class I didn't understand. And I would go home and I'd be like, they didn't say a damn thing. There was nothing said there. And I think when it comes to AI, all of the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. And so all of the power has been in the hands of the few. And I think those of us who don't come from these elite backgrounds, and certainly those in coded bias who have successfully challenged these systems, had to overcome their imposter syndrome and had to overcome this feeling of, oh my God, I don't deserve a place at the table. When the fact is that these systems are deployed on all of us. And if we have a cell phone, we should understand how it works. And we should not be afraid to challenge systems and ask questions. And so now I am the first person from a working class background who went to the City College of New York who says, I'm sorry, I don't understand what that term means. And that's where it starts, is that we all have to feel like we have a place at the table, that we all have sufficient, by way of using this gadget, we all have a place at questioning AI systems and machine learning, that we should not leave it to the tech bros alone. And so it was really through, through the incredible research of people like Joy Buolamwini, like Kathy O'Neill, like Sophia Moja Noble, who gave me an education. And what I learned is not only were they incredibly astute, I mean, some of the smartest data scientists and mathematicians I've ever met with advanced degrees in mathematics. And I mean, Kathy O'Neill, like, once tried to explain to me how she knitted the equation for pi into a sweater. Like, these people are on some other things. I get half of what they say and half is a lot. And so they're incredibly astute. But they were also women. They were also people of color. They were also LGBTQ. They were from groups that were religious minorities. They had some experience of an experience that was not centralized, that was marginalized, that they could see clearly for whom this system could fail. And what I realized through their scholarship, I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole, is that there was this whole story of data scientists and mathematicians led by feminists and people of color who were leading the fight against ethics, for ethics in AI. And it was their story that really inspired me to say, and I wanted to tell that in sort of a long-winded way, because I want, especially the audience of SUNY Geneseo to know that the things that we don't know and the backgrounds that we think are, we would consider maybe a disadvantage, are actually an asset in rooms like this. And that when we bring our whole selves into rooms where we're talking about AI, that we're able to see into the biases and shine a light into the biases that others miss. And I found that with the brilliant and badass cast of my film. And that's sort of how I came to this story.
Shalini, you actually touch on a number of things that we've been discussing here on campus. I mean, I love that your film is highlighting people that are not traditionally represented in these fields, in the fields of mathematics, in the field of artificial intelligence. That is something that was particularly notable of your film. And we've also been talking a lot about implicit bias and how we all have these implicit biases. And they are not necessarily bad or wrong. I mean, but they are things that that we've grown up with, through our education, through our media. These biases are creeping in, and I think your film does an excellent job, really kind of showing where these implicit biases are creeping in this field of artificial intelligence, per se. So I wanted to say to people here in the audience, I'd love to open it up for questions. I see we have a question already coming in from the chat. While people are formulating their questions, I encourage you to open up your microphones, ask questions. You can use the raise hand feature to ask questions as well. And I'll also be monitoring the chat as well. I think, Paul, you might have a question.
Well, why don't we take the question that's in the chat there from Eddie Lee. I do have one, but I'll hold off.
Sure.
And I can read it. Eddie is a Geneseo, one of our most active and close Geneseo alums and community members. He has a question specifically about law enforcement. And the question is whether you see irony that it was body-worn cameras that revealed the police racism that sparked the BLM protests of last year. The cameras offer accountability and maybe overall safety, yet they may have dire consequences, as your film reveals.
It's a great question, especially as someone as a filmmaker. I even wanted to do a talk about sort of the double camera, that using the eye of the camera to sort of reveal this. And I think you're right. I mean, it has been cameras that have in some way shine a light on some of the most incredible human rights violations, like the George Floyd murder. But I would want to say that I think there's a difference between just cameras and police using real-time facial recognition. And I think Silky Carlo of Big Brother Watch UK really speaks to, I'm originally from New York City, where I live most of the time when it's not COVID. And basically, there are so many CCTV cameras in my city. And she talks about how having real-time facial recognition on those cameras, which, by the way, I don't know if they have, because I have no laws that would make that process transparent to me. That's why all my reporting is in the UK, because there's some laws there that allow that process to be transparent and documented by outside observers. That process is completely opaque to us here in the US, where police departments are using these technologies in secret. I would have no way as a journalist to access that information. I'm not even sure I can FOIA it, file a Freedom of Information request for it. So that's one thing. But if you think about the fact that if you post people protesting, that the police then can scan your face and know your identity, do we have freedom to protest? If you have questionable immigration status or probation status, or you're on public assistance, will you then show up to protest if you know the police are going to scan your face at a protest? I think that it sort of changes the texture of life in a free society. And I think we haven't yet had a conversation about what it means that we are increasingly picking up the tools of authoritarian states and using them without government authorities oversight in a democracy. And I'll give you the example when I knew I had to be afraid. And this was like a rare moment where I saw something that I never saw on TV, which is I was sitting in a congressional hearing with Joy testifying, and I saw a right-wing Republican from Ohio, Jim Jordan, agree with AOC, left-wing Democrat from New York. And I never saw that ever in any news ever. And there was a moment where Jim Jordan said, wait a minute, 117 million Americans are in a police database that they can access without a warrant. And there is no one elected overseeing this program. And that's when I began to realize big tech is selling this, the racially biased software that Joy identifies as not seeing Black faces accurately, specifically having the highest failure rate on women of color, was not in a lab somewhere. This is technology that is being sold to the FBI, sold to ICE immigration, and actively being used by law enforcement, oftentimes in secret, with no one we elected, no one representing we the people, giving oversight to how these technologies are used.
And technology that's being developed by Amazon too.
By Amazon and Microsoft and all of these sort of technologies. And that's where I feel like we haven't yet drawn the line. And some people say to me, well, is the cost benefit enough? Well, I'm wondering where the facial recognition was on January 6th. But here's what the question that I ask, which is who gets to decide? Who gets to make the call about when it's the right thing to use these powerful technologies? And especially when we know it's invasive surveillance, it's biometric data that I would liken to a fingerprint or your genetic data, both of which require a police warrant to access some sort of probable cause. And yet the police are storing our biometric data in a database, and we don't know how it's being used. And so my big question is shouldn't we have a conversation about this in a free society, about how these technologies are deployed and how? And shouldn't someone that we elected have some oversight in how these technologies are used? And it shouldn't be up to big tech in partnership with law enforcement. And that's the argument that I'm making in Coded Bias, is that who gets to decide, and that it should be we the people.
I think that leads into another question that has come in from the chat. This is from Anju Sika in the psychology department. And Anju says, hi, Shalini, thanks for your talk in the film Coded Bias. The film is truly eye-opening. What initiatives do you know that have a goal of creating transparency in how algorithms are used?
Great question. I think that I love conversations like this one because I think we're just at the beginning of education and basic algorithmic literacy. We can't challenge these systems if we don't understand them. So I think that is the first. I feel like it's great we're having this conversation at the university level. I hope that sixth graders, the moment they get a cell phone, have basic literacy of how these cell phones work, about data literacy, about where the information is going, about what could happen if you post a picture on Facebook and that they will have it forever. All of these sorts of data and privacy, we need some basic literacy from the age we start using these devices. So I think the literacy is part of that. We just can't leave it up to the big magic of the math guys. And I think we can look to Europe. Europe has something called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regimen. It's the first thing I've seen that really, and we don't know what's going to happen with the UK as the UK departs Europe, what will happen to all their rights that they got under the European Union. So UK is up for grabs right now. But what it does is it actually is the beginning of some understanding that data rights are human rights, that data rights are civil rights, that every single right that we enjoy as citizens and people of a democracy will be transformed by algorithms and AI, often in ways that we don't understand and are opaque to us. And so passing some sort of legislation is important. Now, what is so tricky about this whole thing is that people always ask me about what they can do. And I sort of scratch my head and I'm like, well, you cannot film protesters and post them on the web because the police can actually scan their face and, you know, that protects them. Okay, Signal is a little bit better than WhatsApp and Blue Jeans is a little better than Zoom. But the truth is that we can't opt out of any of these systems anymore. This is the only way we can be together. And I don't know how many of you read the terms of conditions of Zoom for privacy. I did not. And so we need some basic legislation that will protect us. And that starts to feel overwhelming when I say, actually, we need systematic change. But I would go to codedbias.com. There's a take action page. There's incredible organizations like the ACLU of New York is doing great work, specifically in our region of the woods. Fight for the Future is a great youth-based organization. They've been doing a lot of work about banning facial recognition on college and university campuses and music concerts where there were music concerts. And when you pass a university, if we could get the SUNY system, for instance, to pass a facial recognition ban, it starts a conversation. Why are you passing a facial recognition ban? Why is this? And it starts sort of a community-wide conversation. If you were able, per se, to start a data privacy law to SUNY students, that would be a huge population with broad sweeping, start a conversation across the state that then spreads to other campuses and maybe to state legislation. And I'm saying this because I've really seen that, first of all, local cities and states have been the first to adapt bans. You're seeing San Francisco, Oakland, Somerville, Cambridge, technological hubs that are actually the most tech savvy, who understand how these systems work, be the first to ban facial recognition by law enforcement. And when they do that, we come closer to a state ban. In California, we had legislation that was ultimately nixed, but was on the table for the first time around data privacy in California. Illinois has some limited legislation. And I feel like when we start to do that, we come closer to a statewide legislation. I mean, a nationwide legislation, because what happened with GDPR is, like, the big companies like Google and Facebook, they don't want to do one set of policies for Europe and then one set for the US. So we started to get rights by way of these Europeans passing laws. And even with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, some of us as voters have rights to that information because our data transited through Europe. And so we were able to get some recourse because our data transited through Europe. And so I think the more that we can push at the local and state for transparency, the more that we can start to take action at the university level. You know, even a building, what if the Black Student Union could be a no facial recognition zone? That starts to send a national conversation. Why are we doing this? Because this technology is racially biased. And if we care about Black lives, then we care about these technologies that disproportionately, can impact Black communities more, and have been proven to do so across all the research that's been done, including by Big Brother Watch, where upwards of 85%, I'm using the most conservative statistics, upwards of 85% of the population was stopped and frisked for no reason. It was all misidentifications because of this technology. So that's sort of my answer, is support local organizations, great organizations on our website like the Algorithmic Justice League and ACLU and so many others, and also push at the local level, because it's really where we can make a great deal of change.
Speaking at the local level, this gets at a question that Riley Grossman was asking Do you know what types of biased algorithms may be used at colleges and universities like SUNY Geneseo?
You know, I don't really know, but that is sort of the scary part is we don't sort of know how these AI systems are working. I'll give you an example. I randomly was at a TED conference and I ended up having lunch back when you could talk to random people before COVID. And I started talking about the film I was making that I could barely explain at the time. And he was the superintendent of schools in New Jersey. And he came to know secretly, quite through his own research, that algorithms or machine learning was being used to grade the essay portion of a standardized test that had big implications for statewide placement. And he found out, even though he was a superintendent of schools, he found out quite by accident. And because he did a lot of research, he told me that he was looking through the backlogs for how this was being. Now, I know how this works. So I know that now that these AI systems don't speak English, they speak mathematics, right? And they're crunching statistical mathematics. And so a kid like me whose mother's first language was in English and who grew up with a big, I had a big gap in vocabulary going to college because my English skills were limited, but I was a super passionate student. And so my essay would have been completely passionate, but maybe I used less big words, right? Like my vocabulary was more limited. I maybe would have been at a disadvantage had an AI system graded my essay. And
It reminds me in the film too about the value added model of teacher evaluation in Houston that you were illustrating, that teachers were actually being evaluated using this machine learning, using this artificial intelligence, and the people that actually designed the systems weren't exactly even sure how the algorithms themselves were working.
Well, they never know how the algorithms are working. That's what I learned, is even the people who program it know that it's kind of right, but it's almost like going inside your brain. You don't quite actually know where the thoughts are coming from or how it arrived at that decision. And that thing with the value added model, that model is still being used to grade teachers in Florida where they're using it. And the system, I don't know how this happened. The model, the algorithm model was originally designed to actually evaluate fertility in cows. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. And there's research to back this up. I didn't have time to put it in the film.
I was just saying, it should have been in the film.
There are 5 films in this one film. But that's exactly how the value added model came to be. And then it came to be grading teachers. And it goes to show that it's because we don't understand how these systems work. What are you grading? You're grading standardized tests. Does that deal with the quality of I know that they're great teachers. Could I have told you what they did for me that changed my life in these algorithmic terms? You know, what made their score change my life? No. And so it goes to show that we don't even have data that could support, that can decide, is a teacher a good teacher, right? But we're using it to evaluate that. Or if you look at it's being used for predictive policing, right? And saying like, oh, well, these neighborhoods have had more crime, so we should go back to these same neighborhoods. We don't have crime data. I live in Brooklyn, 10 minutes from Wall Street. Those people aren't arrested for the crimes that they're committing every half a second. And so you're not getting crime data, you're getting arrest data, right? And so the question becomes, these communities that have been historically over-policed, are we just going back to those same neighborhoods? And, you know, like the decision that was made of LaTanya Myers, who was a model citizen since she had an arrest when she was a minor, had been a model citizen, had sort of accolades from the mayor, from the city council in this algorithm because she had offended when she was 12 years old. She was 21, and this algorithm randomly was saying that she was high risk. And what was so dangerous about that situation is that that would require her to report like almost twice a week during work hours. She couldn't hold a job. And so that judgment of calling her high risk when she wasn't would then put her in a system where she was more vulnerable to actually going back into the system for not reporting because she was trying to hold a job and do the right thing. And it was giving her no opportunity for redemption. And that's what's so scary, is it becomes almost like a deterministic model where all you can be is who you've been. All you can be is like being judged by what your friends did or what your community did. And it happens, like, you guys are students. Kids that were from Asian communities, historically, communities that had higher concentrations of Asians, were getting ads that were higher pricing for SAT prep than other communities. Versus in a Latina community down the street in a lower income zip code, those kids are getting predatory University of Phoenix ads. And none of this is transparent to us. So these are the dangers that we've not yet sort of pulled back the Wizard of Oz curtain on, that I think are dangerous.
Your film does a really good job at kind of illuminating two different problems that are going on. One is the simple recognition of people of color. The facial recognition software is not recognizing people of color. It was not designed to recognize people of color, and yet it's being used for this surveillance. The second issue is the surveillance issue and the implicit bias in using that surveillance. So with the surveillance systems being everywhere, what is the particular risks for people of color in particular?
Well, I would say with facial recognition, and specifically with dark faces, black faces, there's an incredible risk there. When you have that level of misidentification and the fact, coupled with the fact that it's used in secret, is kind of scary to me. I mean, the fact that, one of the things that I grappled with the most was this black child that was stopped in my film. He was 14 years old wearing a school uniform, didn't understand, and he's so calm. I would have been losing it if 8 police officers had surrounded me. In the way that he just is so calm, it's really, it really makes me shudder, actually, in that sort of situation. And had he responded any other way, what could have happened to him in that kind of situation from a wrong identification? And he would have been in his own right to have lost his stuff, because I would have lost mine if I had been in the same situation, wrongly identified by 5 police officers like that, plain clothes like that. So I think that is a real danger, and we don't know it in the States. Like, we had the first known misidentification of a black man in Detroit in January, and we only know about it by accident. He was arrested in front of his family and his neighbors, the kind of humiliation you don't recover from, and held for 30 hours and never asked for his ID because of facial recognition. And in spite of that, the Detroit police is continuing to use this technology, and oftentimes without us knowing it. And to me, that to me is like the most extreme. And when you're talking about that racially biased invasive surveillance technology, coupled with the power of law enforcement, that's where it gets tricky. Or when you're talking about someone like LaTanya Myers, where you're being given a score about that is weighted, and the judge doesn't know how to weight that score. You're talking about someone's life and liberty here, and that's an algorithm that she couldn't have challenged. And so that is where I feel like the highest risks are.
Shalini, you made a point earlier today that with these gadgets, right, we have the opportunity to be at the table for the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the film makes the point that it's exactly when we all started to use these gadgets that big tech was able to assemble enough data for these algorithms to do their work. So given how important the devices are to us, it becomes important also, as you described, for us to regulate how the algorithms are used.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, while we're fighting for that regulation and those protections, what I'm wondering is whether, having made the film, you found that you changed any of your own data practices. Did you find yourself unsubscribing from any social media platforms, or just sharing fewer pictures, or what was the sort of personal impact on you of learning all of this about how your data is being used?
Well, I always use social media in incredibly conservative ways. My approach has always been, what do I want everyone to know forever? The whole world to know forever is my status of everything I post. So you don't see very personal things of me. And, I have this gorgeous family picture. It's the first picture of my family. I won't post it on Instagram because then they own it. And so it really did. We all remember that moment. I remember the first time I had a private conversation about the Grand Canyon, and Instagram jacked into my phone and direct, messaged me about Instagram. They were listening when I wasn't posting. And the thing is like, I definitely have tightened up, and I think social media as a deep thinker can be the enemy of progress. If you want to actually further your knowledge, it kind of it definitely is distracting. But I think that the main thing that I do is I try not to be on autoplay. I think that we haven't yet taught about like the algorithmic hand, because it starts really slow. Like, would you like to listen to this song next? Would you like to watch this movie next? And then before you know it, it becomes, would you like to vote for this candidate? And that invisible hand, we've not begun to analyze. That power of suggestion, that silent nudge of being on autoplay, where it takes us, where the algorithm takes us. I'm a lot more skeptical about that kind of curation. I try to go more to people who are curators, like DJs, and art curators, and film critics that when I look for media. So that's one way. I'm very skeptical about news. I think that we need to roll back Section 230 of the federal the FCC, that says that technology companies don't have to tell the truth. One of the things that I think is most dangerous for a democracy is that Facebook said our political ads don't have to be vetted for the truth. I think that they turned their backs on democracy when they made that decision. And I've told them as much, and also that actually to some of the people who work there, actually, and I think that it's also, there are more laws that govern my behavior as a journalist, as an independent journalist, than govern Facebook. Which means if you slander me on Facebook, I can sue you, but not Facebook. And as long as they have no accountability whatsoever, and 1 billion people are getting their news from Facebook, our democracy is in trouble, because misinformation is the seed of of how authoritarian regimes rise. So that to me is a huge problem. But I think I really just think we need some laws. I know it's terrible, and it's not what everybody wants to hear, because everyone's like, how can I change my privacy settings? And I just don't think that's the fix. I think the fix is like, support your ACLU and let's get some laws on the table, like the GDPR. I think that's really the direction we have to go. And we have a human rights declaration on our site that declares data rights as human rights. And I think the more that we can convince our legislators that this is the way that we need to go and rein big tech in, that will, until we do that, until there's some balance to their unbridled power, I think our democracy is in trouble.
I have a couple of filmmaker questions, if that's okay.
Oh, I love them.
So, so the computer HAL from 2001 makes a couple of appearances in the film. One, it's part of a news broadcast. So maybe that's just sort of, you know, by the way. But then I noticed, you know, the first music as the credits are rolling is the Blue Danube. And there's the story that Zeynep tells about the Soviet defense technician who decides not to launch missiles, right? That's kind of a Dr. Strangelove moment. So,
thank you. Oh my God. Thank you for being old enough to have good taste in science fiction.
I can't help being old enough. Nothing I can do about it. But so I guess my question is whether Kubrick was an influence at all in this?
Absolutely, and I have to tell you that I didn't realize how many people would have not seen 2001. So when I was at Sundance, they did a screening to high school students, and I did how many of you guys have seen 2001? And anyway, so if you haven't seen it, it's extraordinary. It's science fiction history. It should be seen by every student of every age. But Stanley Kubrick was an incredible inspiration to me. And what I learned is that there was always this conversation between science fiction writers and the science fiction imagination of filmmakers and actual people who were designing AI. And so what I didn't know is that Marvin Minsky, who was head of the MIT AI lab at the time, was in conversation with Arthur C. Clarke, who was the one who wrote 2001.
Yeah.
So it was actually Marvin Minsky at the MIT lab who created HAL, this bad robot, who I pay homage to in the film. And I think that and I learned that they were in conversation about building an elevator to the moon, and Marvin Minsky actually got money from it for MIT and spent 6 months trying to build an elevator to the moon because some sci-fi writer thought it was a great idea. Arthur C. Clarke thought it was a great idea. So there's always been this sort of relationship between, I think, sci-fi people who, like, I would include myself, who imagine the future, and actual AI creators who build the future. And I think that that's always been there. And I think that both of those imaginations have been kind of limited by white men. And what I hope is that this sort of expands the conversation about what science fiction could be and what AI could be into this sort of realm of maybe it doesn't have to be all about surveillance capitalism and this one way. And if you look at AI, like including a lot of the AI, the science fiction I love, like Blade Runner, I won't say it, but men always have this like fantasy about having a romance with their AI. And I think the feminist AI might have a different imagination about how these systems might work. And so it's sort of that I'm sort of playing with. And I hope that sort of homage to science fiction helps us understand how AI is working in the now, and also helps us unleash a new imagination about ways that it could work in the future.
That's such a great answer. Thank you so much. So one other quick filmmaker question. You're telling so many different stories in this film. There's so many different threads. You're following different people. You're following Kathy O'Neill, and you're following Joy. You're following the folks on the streets in England. And you're talking about surveillance, but you're also talking about bias. They're related, but they're not exactly this. The big brother question is not exactly the same as the one about bias built into algorithms. So I wonder if you could speak at all to sort of how you approach the challenge of weaving all of these threads together in a way that tells a coherent. I mean, you know, the film is not at all hard to follow, even though it's got so many different pieces moving at the same time. And I wonder if you could just sort of speak to the creative dimension of that.
It was massively challenging. I always joke that I couldn't talk to people for 2 years because I was so scared that they would ask me what I was doing. And I'd be like, I'm making a film about racist robots. That was the original title of the film, Racist Robots. And it was really hard for me to explain. And in some ways, it would have been much easier to make a film about facial recognition because it was so, but I felt like they were all connected. And so what I hope to do, and I think when we had the first screening of the film, I call it in documentary, I affectionately call it the dark night of the soul in documentary, which is the period of the film, of your film, where your film is a mess. It makes no sense to anyone, not even really to you. And you're trying to build a story out of it. And the thing is, for a documentary filmmaker, that can be like 2 years of your life. It can be a really long time where you're sort of wrestling with it. And I think our first test screenings, we would literally be like, did that make sense? Did you get that? And we really had to do test studies about, like, was that understood? Could you distill that? And so it was really this really careful and so daunting process of trying to get someone's PhD dissertation down to a 2-minute bite that was somehow cinematic. And then to take that and also try to connect it to someone where there was some stakes, why it mattered. And I think that's something that sometimes scientists miss, because honestly, I met a lot of these scientists. Some of them are brilliant and well-meaning, and they're not thinking about facial recognition and law enforcement. They're thinking about, how do I detect autism early symptoms of autism, and facial recognition is going to help with that. And why not do that? So you have a researcher who's in the pixels of that, and then the person who's selling it is doing something else with the technology that they invented. And so it was just extraordinarily challenging to tell a cohesive story. And I think also technology is always told in a way that excludes people. I'm amazed listening to Elon Musk. I wonder if any people exist in his world in the future. And I saw someone tweet, which something I thought was so poignant, which is, I've gone to so many future of technology conferences, but none about the future of humanity. And I think that what my film sort of tries to do is to firmly root the story of technology and the story of humanity. And if I've done my job right, I hope that we will start to think about technology as servant of humanity, instead of humanity being servants of technology, sort of subservient to the technology. And I think that's the world that we're fighting, is a world where our humanity has become subservient, or our human intelligence has become subverted by machine intelligence. And, I think I argue in the film that our empathy is our strongest trait as a human being. Our compassion is our strongest ability as a human being. Pretty soon we will live in an age where the sum total of everything we know is going to be in a robot. It's not too long from now, where all of human intelligence is going to be in one machine. It will happen. It may even happen within our lifetimes. But I think that that is not intelligence. And so it's this reframing of what intelligence is. And it's my hope that we start to bring our hearts to in technology. And I saw a question in the chat about, this garbage in and garbage out. And when I talk to technologists, they're like, we're just going to create a perfect algorithm. And it's just, we'll fix the data. It'll all be clean. We'll have perfect invasive surveillance. Black people will be completely well recognized by facial recognition. It'll be a perfect world. And I think, to me, what I'm hoping people do is say, what is this race towards technology? Is that the goal? is efficiency and going as fast as we can the goal of life? And what are we losing in this race to efficiency? And I think we're losing some of our humanity. And so the film hopefully is a call to connect technology with our humanity.
I think you actually do a really good job trying to connect the technology to humanity. And I also think you do a fantastic job of trying to center the story away from white men too, white men that have dominated these fields for so long. And I think we may have only time for one or two more questions, but I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about Joy Buolamwini, and how you got connected with her, and how Joy has continued this work after the film.
Well, I think Joy is extraordinary because you know, we're depending on her, having people like Joy in rooms where these technologies are being sort of beta tested. Having scholars like Joy Buolamwini, like Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was ousted from Google, that there've been a lot of a conversation around, like Deborah Raji, was incredibly important, because consider for a fact that 3 Black women graduate students found racial bias that the 3 largest, richest, most powerful multinational technology companies in the world missed. How does that happen? It's a pretty big thing for them to miss. Either they weren't missing it, or there weren't enough people in the room saying that you should pay attention to this before it goes to market, before they're racing it to put it on our shelves. And that, to me, is the power of inclusion. What I learned in the making of the film is that inclusion, particularly in a scientific context, is not just something that's good for the pictures. It actually makes us more innovative in the industries of the future. When we build inclusive and diverse teams, we come up with better ideas. That we all need each other to see into each other's biases. And so that is incredibly critical. And I think that the other thing I want us to prepare for is that inclusion is not a superficial thing. I think that that's what happens. And I think people sometimes bring me onto a film because they're like, oh, we want to tell a story about this. And I'm like, yeah, but you have to understand, like, you can't just bring me on and put these people at the foreground and tell the same story. The entire story is going to change when you start to reframe it. And that's what inclusion is. You have to be really ready for structural change. For these 3 Black women scientists upended an industry. And that is the power of inclusion, and the power when we're listening. And so that's why I'm so grateful for conversations like this one.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. I just want to say how much I appreciate how hopeful your perspective is, both in the film and here. The film left me feeling appropriately worried about technology, but not depressed. Right? And I think that the arc of the film is a very hopeful one, with the way that it ends with Joy, you know, having her moment in Congress, and those Brooklyn tenants getting the attention they deserve, and the prospect of passing laws and regulations that can enable us, as you said a moment ago, to keep technology connected to the human. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. I'm grateful to all of our attendees for being with us here today. I want to thank everybody on behalf of the Diversity Commission, and say that I hope everyone took something from this that they can apply as they move forward in their journey towards anti-racism. And I want to remind everybody that we have more events coming up, more that are planned. Dave, I don't know if you've put the link in the chat, but maybe you could, or Crystal, to the calendar. This has really been wonderful. Again, thank you so much, Shalini.
Thank you so much for having me. And don't forget to go to codedbias.com and go to the Take Action page where you can learn more.
Thank you very much. And we've included links to the Take Action page in the chat as well. So hopefully people can go right to it. Thank you very much
for having me.